Jake Mercer had been living in the same log cabin outside Kalispell, Montana for 7 years, ever since he left the Army. The place sat on 12 acres of pine forest with a view of the Rockies that most people only saw in postcards. At 42 years old, he made his living as a wilderness guide, taking hunters and hikers through terrain he knew better than the lines on his own palms. His only real companion was Echo, a gray wolf dog hybrid he'd rescued from a shelter in Whitefish. The animal had the intelligence of a working dog and the instincts of something wilder, which suited Jake just fine. He didn't need much conversation these days. The mountains provided all the company he required. It was early December when Jake's last client of the season canceled. A dentist from Boston who wanted to photograph elk in their winter habitat had called 3 days before their scheduled expedition, apologizing profusely about a family emergency. Jake told him not to worry about it, that these things happen. But the truth was, he'd been counting on that money to get through the slow winter months. He spent the morning drinking coffee on his porch, watching fresh snow accumulate on the branches, trying to decide whether to take odd jobs in town or tighten his belt until spring bookings picked up. By noon, he'd made a different decision entirely. He would scout a new winter route through the Whitefish Range, an area he'd been wanting to explore for potential clients. The weather forecast showed a 3-day window before the next big storm system moved in. It was enough time. He packed his gear with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. A 4-season tent, cold weather sleeping bag, water filtration system, freeze-dried meals, first aid kit, emergency beacon, and his Glock 19. He wore layers of merino wool under a Gore-Tex shell, and on his feet were his old Danner combat boots, the same ones he'd worn during his last years in the service. He'd had them resoled 2 years ago with a custom tread pattern, a zigzag design with his initials worked into the heel. The cobbler in Kalispell had thought he was crazy for spending that much on old boots, but Jake had explained they'd carried him through Afghanistan and he wasn't ready to let them go. The man had understood then, or at least pretended to. Echo seemed excited about the trip, dancing around Jake's truck as he loaded the gear. They left just after 1 in the afternoon, driving 40 minutes on Highway 93 before turning onto a Forest Service road that wound up into the mountains. Jake parked at a trailhead he'd used dozens of times, shouldered his pack, and started hiking. The snow was about 6 inches deep, perfect for tracking. The sky was that particular shade of gray that meant more snow was coming, but not for hours yet. He moved at a steady pace, Echo ranging ahead and then circling back, nose to the ground, reading the stories written in scent and track. 3 miles in, where the trail split near a frozen creek, Jake saw them, boot prints in the snow, fresh enough that the edges were still crisp. They led off the main trail toward a steep-sided canyon he'd never explored. At first, he assumed another hiker had come through that morning, but something made him kneel down and look closer. The tread pattern stopped his breath. It was his pattern, the distinctive zigzag with initials in the heel, clear as a signature. Jake stood up slowly, looking around the empty forest. Echo had stopped about 20 feet ahead, staring at the tracks with his ears flat against his skull. Jake examined his own boots, then the prints in the snow. Size 10.5, wide, his size. The same wear pattern on the outside heel where he tended to roll his ankle slightly. He followed the tracks for about 50 yards, trying to make sense of it. Maybe the cobbler had used the same custom tread for another customer. Maybe someone had found his exact boots at a military surplus store. But even as he formed these explanations, they felt hollow. The prints were too fresh, too precise. They'd been made within the last few hours, and Jake had been the only vehicle at the trailhead. He decided to follow them, telling himself it was just curiosity, that he'd go a quarter mile and then turn back. But a quarter mile became half a mile, and the prints kept leading deeper into the canyon. They moved with purpose, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Whoever made them hadn't hesitated at the difficult crossings or the steep descents. They'd moved like a scout, like someone with military training. Jake felt a cold understanding settle into his gut, but he pushed it away. He'd deal with the implications later. The afternoon light was fading when Jake finally stopped to make camp. He'd followed the mysterious boot prints for nearly 3 hours, covering rough terrain that would have exhausted most hikers. But Jake had been trained for this kind of movement. His body still remembered the long patrols through Afghan mountains, even if his mind tried to forget. He set up his tent on a small plateau that offered protection from the wind and a clear view of the surrounding ridges. Echo refused to settle, pacing the perimeter of the tent and whining softly. his yellow eyes constantly scanning the tree line as if watching for something Jake couldn't see. That night, sitting in his tent with a camping stove heating water for coffee, Jake tried to read a paperback western he'd brought along. The words wouldn't stick. His mind kept drifting back to Afghanistan, to the dusty mountains outside Kandahar where he'd spent 18 months as part of a reconnaissance unit. He'd been good at his job, maybe the best in his platoon at reading terrain and tracking enemy movement. His partner had been Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, a kid from Georgia with a slow smile and a faster mind. Marcus had worn the same Danner boots, bought at the same surplus store before deployment. They'd joked about being boot brothers, about leaving matching prints across half of Helmand Province. Marcus had died 9 years ago, caught in an ambush that Jake had somehow survived. They'd been tracking an insurgent cell through a mountain pass when the shooting started. Jake remembered the sound of the bullets, the way Marcus had fallen, the desperate radio call for evacuation that came too late. He remembered holding Marcus as the light left his eyes, blood soaking into the Afghan dust, making promises he couldn't keep about telling Marcus's girlfriend back home how brave he'd been, how he hadn't suffered, lies that felt necessary in that moment. After that, the Army had sent Jake to Germany for debriefing, then to Walter Reed for evaluation, then eventually back to his unit. But something had changed. The mountains felt different. He couldn't sleep without seeing Marcus's face, without hearing that wet, rattling breath. 6 months later, he'd taken a medical discharge and come home to Montana, as far from the desert as he could get. Jake hadn't thought about Marcus in years. Not really. He'd packed those memories away along with his uniforms and medals, stored them in the mental equivalent of the footlocker under his bed. But now, lying in his sleeping bag with Echo pressed against his side, he couldn't stop remembering. The way Marcus used to hum while he walked, some country song about going home. His terrible jokes that nobody laughed at but him. The photo he'd carried of his girlfriend Sarah, a pretty blonde he'd planned to marry when the deployment ended. Jake closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the questions kept circling. Why would he think of Marcus now? Why would his mind make that connection between these impossible boot prints and a man who'd been dead for nearly a decade? It was just a coincidence, nothing more. The human brain was wired to find patterns even where none existed, but sleep wouldn't come. Around midnight, Jake gave up and sat outside the tent, watching the stars appear through breaks in the cloud cover. Echo sat beside him, alert and tense. The temperature had dropped to somewhere around 15 degrees, cold enough that Jake could see his breath in thick clouds. He thought about the boot prints he'd been following, about how they'd moved through the landscape with such confidence. Whoever made them knew this terrain, understood how to navigate in winter conditions, how to read the subtle signs that indicated safe crossing points and dangerous slopes. It was the kind of knowledge that came from years of experience, the kind of intuitive understanding that couldn't be faked. A thought occurred to him then, one he'd been avoiding all day. What if the prints weren't someone else's? What if they were his own, made during some period he couldn't remember? But that was impossible. Jake had a clear memory of the past few days. He'd been at his cabin, working on equipment maintenance, reading, living his normal solitary life. He hadn't been hiking in this canyon. He was certain of it, and yet, as he examined his certainty more closely, he found it had a strange quality, like a photograph that looked real but lacked the fine detail of actual memory. When he tried to remember specific moments from the past week, what he'd eaten for breakfast 3 days ago, or what he'd read in his book, the details felt fuzzy, generic. The next morning brought crystal clear skies and bitter cold. Jake broke camp quickly, eager to get moving and warm up his muscles. The boot prints continued, and he followed them with growing unease. They didn't behave like normal tracks. They doubled back on themselves for no apparent reason, circled the same lightning-struck pine 3 times in a perfect spiral, stopped at the edge of cliffs where no rational person would stand. At one point, the prints led directly to a frozen waterfall, and Jake had to search for 20 minutes to find where they picked up again on the other side. It was as if whoever made them wasn't concerned with efficiency or safety, as if they were following some internal logic that had nothing to do with getting from point A to point B. Jake photographed everything with his phone, took measurements with a tape measure from his pack, confirmed again and again that the prints matched his boots exactly. Not just similar, but identical. The same distinctive wear pattern, the same depth and stride length, even the same slight drag on the right foot that came from an old ankle injury. The temperature was dropping again and dark clouds were building to the west. the leading edge of the storm system the Weather Service had predicted. The smart move was to turn back, to get off the mountain before the weather turned dangerous. But he couldn't let it go. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and he needed to understand what. When he tried to get Echo to follow the tracks into a narrow ravine choked with deadfall and loose rock, the wolf dog planted his feet and refused to move. Jake tried coaxing him with treats, then ordering him in the firm voice he used for training, but Echo just stared with those yellow eyes and wouldn't budge. The animal's hackles were raised, his body language screaming danger in a way Jake had learned to trust. Finally, reluctantly, Jake tied him to a sturdy pine with enough lead to move around, left him water and an energy bar, and continued alone into the ravine. The terrain got rougher, more treacherous. Jake had to use his hands as much as his feet, pulling himself up steep sections and carefully testing his weight before committing to each move. The boot prints continued ahead of him, somehow navigating this impossible route without hesitation. After 2 hours of brutal climbing, Jake emerged onto a high ridge he'd never seen before. According to his topographical map, there shouldn't be any structures in this area, but there ahead of him stood an old fire lookout tower, its wooden frame weathered gray by decades of mountain weather. The tower was probably from the 1960s, with a wooden staircase that wound up 40 feet to a small cabin perched on top. The boot prints led straight to the base of the stairs and disappeared, as if whoever made them had simply climbed up and vanished. Jake approached slowly, every instinct telling him to be careful. The stairs groaned under his weight, but held. He climbed carefully, testing each step for rot, his hand on the railing that felt solid despite its age. At the top, the cabin door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. What he found made his blood run cold. Military gear was spread across a wooden table that dominated the small space. A compass, the exact model he'd carried in Afghanistan. Topographical maps marked with patrol routes in red pencil, the handwriting familiar in a way that made his stomach turn. MRE wrappers scattered on the floor, the same meals he'd eaten 1,000 times during his deployment. A K-bar knife with a USMC insignia, though Jake had been Army, not Marines. And sitting in the corner, a satellite phone with just enough battery left for one call, its screen showing recent activity from 3 weeks ago. Jake picked up one of the maps with shaking hands. It showed these Montana mountains, the ridges and valleys he'd been hiking through, but overlaid with notations that didn't belong. Afghan province names written in the margins: Kandahar, Helmand, Uruzgan. Coordinates where IEDs had supposedly been found, marked with skull and crossbones symbols. Notes about enemy movements, patrol schedules, safe houses. Someone had taken this peaceful American wilderness and transformed it into a war zone on paper. And the handwriting, Jake realized with growing horror, was his own. He recognized the way he formed his sevens with a cross through them, the distinctive slant of his capital letters, the abbreviations he'd developed during countless mission briefings. He found a journal tucked under the compass, a cheap spiral-bound notebook with a green cover that looked like it had been purchased at any gas station in America. The entries were dated over the past 2 years, and they described a parallel life Jake had no memory of living. Patrol reports, enemy sightings, notes about maintaining operational security, all of it written in his handwriting, all of it describing events that hadn't happened, at least not here in Montana, not in civilian life. Some entries mentioned Marcus, talked about covering his six, about making sure he got home to that girlfriend Sarah, but Marcus was dead, had been dead for 9 years, buried in a cemetery in Savannah that Jake had visited exactly once before he couldn't handle it anymore. Jake's hands were shaking as he flipped through the pages, his breath coming short and fast. There were gaps in the journal, places where weeks or months seemed to be missing, and then he found an entry from 3 weeks ago that stopped his heart completely. It described him sitting in this exact lookout tower, confused and disoriented about how he'd gotten here, finding his own tracks in the snow leading to this place. The entry was lucid, almost clinical in its assessment. It talked about memory gaps, about lost time, about waking up in strange places with no recollection of the journey. The entry ended with a single sentence written in shaky letters that looked like they'd been formed by a hand that could barely hold the pen. "I think I'm losing my mind." Jake sat down hard on the floor, the journal falling from his hands. He tried to remember being here 3 weeks ago. Nothing came. He tried to remember writing these entries, making these maps, bringing this gear up to the tower. Nothing. There was just blank space where those memories should have been. like chapters torn from a book or scenes cut from a movie. He pulled out his phone with fumbling fingers, nearly dropped it twice before managing to pull up his sister's number in Seattle. Michelle answered on the third ring, her voice bright and cheerful, asking how he was doing, saying she'd been meaning to call, but work had been crazy. Jake asked her about his time in the service, trying to keep his voice steady. He asked about specific dates, specific operations he remembered. Michelle answered some questions easily, confirmed some details, but other things she said didn't match his memories at all. She mentioned an accident in Colorado in 2016, a training exercise where he'd fallen and hit his head badly enough to be hospitalized. Jake had no memory of Colorado. He remembered being stationed at Fort Benning in Georgia that year, teaching tracking courses to new recruits, living in base housing, and dating a teacher from town. Michelle insisted it had happened, that she'd flown out to Denver, that he'd been unconscious for 2 days, and the doctors had been worried about brain damage. She said she still had the medical discharge papers if he wanted to see them, that they clearly documented the traumatic brain injury that had ended his military career. Jake told her he was just checking some dates for a memoir he was thinking about writing. The lie came easily, smoothly, and he hated himself for how natural it felt. After he hung up, he sat in the darkening lookout tower and tried to remember Colorado. He tried to remember any training exercise, any hospital stay, any period where he'd been injured. Nothing came. There was just that blank space. 6 months of his life that apparently existed in medical records and his sister's memory, but nowhere in his own mind. He thought about Sarah Chen's question when he'd called her earlier, asking if he'd been taking his medications. What medications? He wasn't on anything, had never been prescribed anything. Or had he? The storm hit that night with the force of nature finally losing patience with human pretensions. Wind screamed around the lookout tower like something alive and angry, shaking the entire structure until Jake was certain it would collapse and send him tumbling 40 feet to the rocks below. Snow came horizontally, thick and blinding, cutting visibility to nothing. The temperature inside the cabin dropped despite the shelter, cold seeping through cracks in the ancient walls. Jake huddled in his sleeping bag, listening to the weather try to tear the tower apart, and forced himself to read the journal from beginning to end. It told the story of someone falling apart slowly, losing grip on what was real and what was memory. The first entries from 2 years ago seemed almost normal. Notes about hiking trails, observations about wildlife, plans for the upcoming guiding season. But gradually, subtly, things changed. References to patrols started appearing, mentions of maintaining radio silence, notes about enemy positions and safe routes through hostile territory. The handwriting stayed the same, but the content shifted from civilian life to military operations, from Montana wilderness to Afghan war zone, the two realities bleeding together until they became indistinguishable. The entries described walking patrols through the mountains at night, sometimes with no recollection of leaving home or how many hours had passed. They mentioned conversations with Marcus, detailed and specific, as if he was really there walking alongside. One entry described an entire firefight, the sound of AK-47 rounds cracking past, the smell of gunpowder and dust, calling for air support that never came. But it had happened here, in these Montana mountains, in a war that existed only in the writer's mind. There were appointments with a VA psychiatrist in Missoula that Jake had no memory of making. There were prescriptions for medications he'd apparently been given but never filled, antipsychotics and mood stabilizers, and medications for traumatic brain injury. One entry, written 8 months ago, was particularly clear-headed and devastating in its clarity. It acknowledged that something was terribly wrong, that the writer was experiencing fugue states and dissociative episodes related to PTSD and traumatic brain injury. It mentioned the head injury in Colorado that Jake couldn't remember, the official diagnosis of chronic traumatic encephalopathy that he'd apparently been given but ignored. The entry described waking up in strange places, finding evidence of activities he couldn't recall, losing hours or days at a time. It talked about how the mountains had become both refuge and prison, a place where he could escape civilian life, but also where his mind could rewrite reality into something more familiar, more structured, more like the war that at least made sense, even if it was hell. The entry ended with a resolution to seek help immediately, to call the VA, to tell Sarah Chen what was happening, to stop guiding alone until he got treatment. But the entries after that one showed no evidence that any of those things had happened. Instead, they described more patrols, more conversations with Marcus's ghost, more boot prints appearing in places the writer swore he hadn't been. The person writing these entries was aware enough to recognize the problem, but not capable of taking action to fix it, trapped in a cycle of awareness and denial that read like a horror story written in real time. When dawn finally came, weak and gray through the storm, Jake understood. The boot prints were his. He'd made them during fugue states, walking patrols through the Montana wilderness while his conscious mind believed he was safely in his cabin. He'd been tracking himself, following his own dissociative episodes like a hunter pursuing an unknown animal, never recognizing that the prey and the predator were the same person. The maps, the journal, the gear in the lookout tower, he'd brought all of it here during states he couldn't remember, building himself a forward operating base in the mountains. He'd recreated the structure and purpose of his military life, because civilian existence had become too unmoored, too meaningless. In war, everything had been clear. You had a mission, a purpose, brothers who depended on you. In peace, he was just a man alone in a cabin, taking tourists on hikes, waiting for nothing. The storm had buried everything in 3 feet of new snow. Jake used the satellite phone to call Sarah, his fingers numb with cold and fear. He told her where he was, that he needed help getting down, that she'd been right to worry. Sarah's voice when she answered was careful, professional, but he could hear the relief underneath. She said she'd been trying to reach him for 3 days, that his sister had called her panicking, that a search and rescue team had been preparing to come looking for him. She said she'd be there as soon as the weather allowed, that he should stay put and stay warm, that everything would be okay. Jake wanted to believe her. 6 hours later, he heard voices calling his name from below. Sarah arrived with 3 other rangers, all of them moving carefully through the hazardous post-storm conditions. They'd had to use snowshoes to get through the fresh accumulation, and their faces were red with cold and exertion when they finally reached the base of the tower. Echo was with them somehow, having either broken free from where Jake had tied him or been found and brought along. The wolf dog bounded up the tower stairs and pressed against Jake's legs, whining softly, and Jake buried his face in the animal's fur and let himself cry for the first time in years. Sarah climbed up to the cabin and looked around at the maps and journals scattered everywhere. Her expression was part relief, part sadness, part something else Jake couldn't quite read. She sat down next to him and said quietly that this wasn't the first time he'd disappeared into the mountains. She said local hunters and hikers had reported seeing him over the past 2 years, hiking alone at odd hours, talking to someone who wasn't there, calling out Marcus's name in the darkness. She'd covered for him with the other rangers, hoping he'd realize he needed help and seek it voluntarily, but now she understood that the problem was bigger than she'd thought. As they packed up Jake's gear and prepared for the long hike out, Sarah told him about the lookout tower. He'd been coming here for at least 18 months, she said. The Forest Service had noticed signs of occupation but hadn't known who was responsible. Jake had no official permission to use it, but he'd been maintaining the structure, keeping it weatherproof, treating it like an actual forward operating base. Echo had apparently been following him on these unconscious journeys, staying nearby, trying to lead him home, but Jake had always pushed forward, deeper into the mountains and deeper into the past. The hike down took most of the day. The fresh snow made every step treacherous, and Jake's legs felt like they belonged to someone else. He moved through the landscape in a daze, recognizing nothing and everything at once. They passed places his boot prints had led, and he tried to remember being there but couldn't. It was like watching a movie of someone else's life, familiar but foreign. When they finally reached the trailhead where Sarah's truck was parked, Jake looked back up at the mountains one last time. Somewhere up there was the lookout tower, his maps and journals, all the evidence of a life he'd been living without knowing it. He wondered how many other versions of himself were out there, wandering through forests and fugue states, fighting wars that had ended years ago. The next few months were the hardest of Jake's life, and he'd survived war, so that was saying something. He checked into the VA hospital in Missoula voluntarily, telling them everything he'd discovered. The doctors weren't surprised. They pulled up his file and showed him records of appointments he didn't remember, prescriptions he'd never filled, warnings from previous evaluations that he'd apparently ignored. The traumatic brain injury from Colorado had been worse than anyone initially realized, causing issues with memory formation, emotional regulation, and dissociation. Combined with severe PTSD from Afghanistan and survivor's guilt over Marcus's death, It had created a perfect storm of psychological and neurological problems. The brain injury explained the fugue states, the lost time, the memory gaps. The PTSD explained why his mind retreated to military structure when civilian life became too chaotic. The survivor's guilt explained why Marcus featured so prominently in his delusions, why Jake's subconscious kept trying to save him, keep him alive, bring him home to that girlfriend, Sarah. It all made horrible clinical sense when the doctors explained it. Jake's brain had been trying to protect him in the only way it knew how, by recreating a reality where he still had purpose, still had his partner, still had a mission that mattered. Therapy was brutal in ways combat never had been. In war, the enemy was external, clearly defined. Now Jake had to fight himself, had to accept that he'd lost nearly 2 years to fugue states and false memories, that huge portions of his recent past simply didn't exist the way he thought they did. He had to grieve properly for Marcus, to sit with the guilt and pain instead of running from it or rewriting it. He had to learn to recognize the early warning signs of dissociation, the subtle feeling of unreality that preceded an episode. He had to develop grounding techniques, ways to anchor himself in the present when his mind tried to slip back to Afghanistan. The medications helped, though Jake hated admitting he needed them. Mood stabilizers to even out the peaks and valleys, antipsychotics to quiet the voices and visions, medication for the brain injury to help with memory and cognition. He felt dulled at first, like someone had turned down the volume on his entire existence. But gradually, he adjusted. The world came back into focus, sharper and clearer than it had been in years. He started to notice things he'd been missing, small details of daily life that his fractured mind had been skipping over. The support group at the VA helped more than anything else, connecting with other veterans who understood what it meant to come home, but never fully leave the war behind, who knew what it felt like to be a stranger in your own life. There was Tom, who'd done 2 tours in Iraq and now worked as a mechanic in Missoula, fighting every day to stay present and not drift back to Fallujah. There was Jennifer, a former medic who'd served in Syria and now had panic attacks in grocery stores when she saw the color red. There was Miguel, who'd been special forces in Afghanistan and now couldn't sleep without checking every room in his house for threats that didn't exist. They shared their strategies, their victories, their setbacks. They didn't judge, didn't offer empty platitudes. They just understood. 6 months after that December storm, Jake made the decision to return to guiding. His therapist was cautious, his sister was worried, but Jake knew he needed to try. The mountains were part of who he was, had been long before the Army and would be long after. But he made changes. He partnered with Tom from the support group, who also loved the wilderness and understood why Jake needed someone watching his back. They established clear protocols, check-in times, emergency procedures. Jake kept detailed logs of where he was and what he was doing, leaving nothing to memory. Sarah made him promise to file comprehensive travel plans with the ranger station before every trip, including expected routes and return times. He kept that promise religiously. Echo stayed by Jake's side through it all, no longer just a companion but a trained service animal. Jake worked with a specialist to develop Echo's natural instincts into specific alerts. The wolf dog learned to recognize when Jake was starting to dissociate, when his gaze became distant and his responses delayed. Echo would push against Jake's legs, whine insistently, even grab his sleeve and pull if necessary. It worked. Several times over those first months back in the mountains, Echo's alerts caught Jake before an episode could fully develop, giving him time to use his grounding techniques and stay present. Jake also made a decision about the fire lookout tower that had become his unintentional psychiatric ward. Instead of abandoning it or letting the Forest Service tear it down, he approached them with a proposal. He wanted to renovate it, turn it into a legitimate backcountry shelter specifically for veterans struggling with combat trauma and transition issues. It took months of paperwork, grant applications, and community organizing, but eventually the project was approved. Jake spent the summer leading volunteer construction crews up the mountain, many of them veterans themselves who understood the mission on a visceral level. They added proper insulation, replaced the rotting sections of floor, installed a wood stove with a chimney that actually drew properly. They brought up emergency supplies, water filtration equipment, a radio for communication with the ranger station. They built bunks that could sleep 6 people, added solar panels for basic electricity, stocked it with shelf-stable food and first aid supplies. Jake painted a sign for the door himself, carefully lettering each word, Webb's Watch, he named it, after Marcus. A place to remember, to grieve, to begin healing. He included Marcus's dates of service and a line from a poem Marcus used to quote, "Not all who wander are lost, but some who wander are finding their way home." On a cold morning in November, almost a year after he'd found his own impossible tracks in the snow, Jake hiked up to Webb's Watch with a small group from the VA. 6 veterans, all dealing with their own versions of his story, their own ghosts and lost time. They moved slowly, taking breaks, nobody rushing. Tom was there, and Jennifer and 3 others Jake had met through the support group. They carried supplies, personal gear, an attitude of cautious hope. When they reached the lookout tower, Jake stood back and let them explore, watching their faces as they discovered what he'd built. One of them, a Marine named David who'd served in Fallujah, picked up the old journal Jake had intentionally left there as a kind of memorial. He read some of the entries silently, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition to something like pain. When he looked up, there were tears tracking down his weathered face. He said it was like reading his own thoughts, his own confusion about who he was supposed to be now that the fighting was over, his own desperate attempts to make sense of a world that had stopped making sense the day he put on a uniform. They spent 2 nights at Webb's Watch, talking and sharing stories as the temperature dropped and stars appeared in impossible numbers overhead. Jake told them about Marcus, about the promises he'd made and couldn't keep, about the guilt that had nearly destroyed him. He told them about the boot prints, about tracking himself through dissociative fugue states, about building this place during episodes he couldn't remember. He told them everything, holding nothing back, and it felt like lancing a wound that had been festering for years. Someone else, Jennifer, talked about losing 3 patients in a single mortar attack and feeling like she should have died with them, like she'd failed some fundamental test of her worth as a medic. Another, Miguel, described coming home to a wife who loved him but couldn't understand him, and how that isolation was worse than combat, because at least in combat you knew who the enemy was. They were all tracking something, Jake realized as he listened. They were all following prints in the snow, trying to find their way back to people they used to be or forward to people they might become. Some were tracking lost innocence, the version of themselves that had existed before war. Others were tracking purpose, trying to find meaning in a civilian world that seemed trivial after life and death stakes. A few were tracking ghosts, friends who hadn't made it home, trying to honor their memory while still living their own lives. They were all lost in different ways, but they were lost together, and that somehow made it bearable. Echo slept by the wood stove, content in a way Jake had rarely seen him. The wolf dog seemed to understand that this place was important, that something healing was happening. On the second morning, they all woke early to watch the sunrise from the tower's observation deck. The mountains stretched out endlessly in every direction, peak after peak fading into blue distance. It was beautiful in a way that hurt, vast and indifferent to human suffering, but also somehow comforting in that indifference. The world was bigger than their pain. It had existed before them and would exist after. They were just passing through, and that was okay. They hiked back down together on that final morning, moving slowly, making sure everyone stayed together. Jake looked back once at Webb's Watch, at the smoke rising from its chimney into the clear mountain air. It wasn't a forward operating base anymore. It wasn't a place to hide from reality or recreate a war that had ended. It was something better, something harder. It was a place to remember without being consumed by memory, a place to grieve without drowning in grief, a place to begin the long, difficult walk home from war, whatever that meant for each person who climbed those stairs. The boot prints Jake left in the fresh snow led down the mountain, toward the valley, toward the town of Kalispell and his cabin, and the life he was slowly, painfully learning to live. And for the first time in years, Jake Mercer followed his own tracks without fear, without confusion, without wondering if they belonged to someone else. They were his prints, his journey, his long walk home. Echo walked beside him, occasionally looking up as if checking that Jake was still present, still there. And Jake was. He was finally, truly home in his own life, following footprints that led not into the past or into delusion, but into whatever future he could build, one careful step at a time.